The dress had taken Mara 3 weeks to finish. Nora had watched her older sister's hands move in the candlelight every night after supper, needle-pulling thread through ivory linen with the kind of patience that only love could sustain. There were small wildflowers embroidered along the collar, pale blue and white, the colors of the Ashfield Omega house, and the hem fell just above the floor in a clean, deliberate line that made Nora look taller than she was. Mara had pressed the finished gown into her arms 2 evenings ago, and said nothing, only smoothed the fabric over Nora's shoulders, and stepped back to look at her with quiet, certain eyes. "You deserve to be seen," she had said finally. "Tonight you will be." Nora had believed her. She believed her still, standing at the entrance of the grand feasting hall of Iron Hollow Keep, the torchlight spilling gold across the stone floors, and the banners of 7 allied packs hanging from iron beams overhead. The hall smelled of burning pine resin, roasted meat, tallow candles, and the sharp undercurrent of dozens of wolves gathered in formal hierarchy. A smell both ancient and charged, like the air before a storm breaks. Long tables ran the length of the room, dressed with dark cloth and heavy pewter, and at the far end, raised on a dais of carved stone, sat the high table where the pack leaders and their chosen would dine. Tonight was the claiming feast. Once every 3 years, the allied packs of the Northern Territories gathered at Iron Hollow for the formal declaration of bonds, the public acknowledgement of chosen mates, new alliances, and pack successions. It was not a ceremony in the soft human sense. It was a declaration of intent before witnesses, binding in the way that only pack law could make things binding. An alpha who called a name at the claiming feast was stating, before every wolf in that hall, that the person named belonged at his side. Cole Ashford had told Nora he would call her name. He had told her in the river meadow behind her inherited cottage 3 months ago, his hand warm against her jaw, his voice low and certain. He had said it again in letters delivered by runner. He had implied it to Mara, who had told their cousin, who had spread the quiet, hopeful knowledge through the small Omega quarter of Ashfield village, like water through dry ground. Nora was 23 years old, unmated, the daughter of a dead farmer with no land worth speaking of, and no pack affiliation beyond the loosest courtesy connection to the Ashford wolves through an old debt. She had no status. She had no dowry. She had her sister's embroidered dress and Cole's promise, and the stubborn, private hope she had been carrying for 8 months, like something fragile cupped between both hands. She walked into the feasting hall with her chin level and her hands still at her sides. The Omegas near the entrance moved aside for her, not with hostility, but with that particular quality of attention that people give to someone about to do something either very brave or very foolish. She felt their eyes. She kept walking. The stone floor was cold through the thin soles of her good shoes, and the torches along the left wall threw flickering shadows across the faces of wolves she had never met. Alphas from packs whose names she only knew from her father's old maps pinned above the cottage hearth. She found a place along the side of the hall, not at the tables. Omegas without formal pack standing did not sit at the tables, and she stood with her back straight and her hands folded, and she waited. Cole arrived with the Ashford delegation 20 minutes later. She saw him before he saw her, or before he chose to see her, she would think later, turning the memory over in the cold hours of the night. He was tall, well-made, with the kind of jaw that looked good in torchlight, and the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had never been uncertain of his welcome in a room. He wore the dark green of the Ashford pack, and there was a woman on his arm. Her name was Delia Voss. Nora knew her by reputation. Daughter of the Voss pack elder, wealthy, well-connected, beautiful in the cool and deliberate way of women who have always known their own worth. She walked beside Cole with the settled ease of someone who had already won a game that others didn't know they were playing. Nora did not move. She did not breathe differently. She watched Cole scan the room with the expression of a man performing a casual search, and she watched his gaze pass over her and continue without pause, and she felt something inside her chest go very quiet, not broken, not yet, but suddenly and absolutely still, the way a candle flame goes still in the second before it's extinguished. He did not look at her again. The feast proceeded. Food was brought. Wine poured. The pack leaders spoke in the formal cadences of territorial diplomacy, and the hall filled with the sound of many voices and the clatter of pewter and the particular restless energy of wolves in close company. Nora ate nothing. She stood at her place along the wall, and she kept her face composed, and she waited, though she no longer knew what she was waiting for. Hope is a strange thing. It does not always know when it has been killed. When Elder Ashford rose to speak, she made herself listen. He spoke of the pack's health, of the year's hunt, of alliances strengthened. And then he nodded to his son, and Cole stood, and Cole turned to the woman beside him, and Cole spoke Delia Voss's name in front of every wolf in Iron Hollow's feasting hall. The sound that went through the room was subtle, a small shift in collective attention, the kind of sound a room makes when something expected by most has finally happened. Nora heard it. She also heard, beneath it, the softer sound of her own breathing, very controlled, very deliberate, the sound of a woman who has decided that she will not give this room the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She turned and walked toward the side corridor that led to the outer passageway. Her hands were not shaking. She was making sure of that. The embroidered flowers on her collar felt very bright suddenly, the blue and white threads her sister had pulled through linen by candlelight for 3 weeks. All of it pressed against her throat like something she could no longer afford to be wearing. She kept her pace even. The corridor was dim, lit by a single torch in an iron bracket, and the stone walls held the cold of the mountain in them like memory. She breathed in, resin, cold air, the faint smell of the forest that came through the narrow window slits. And she breathed out, and she put one hand flat against the stone wall for just a moment, just one moment, to let herself be still. That was either extraordinary composure, said a voice from the shadows to her left, or the most controlled devastation I have ever witnessed. She turned. 3 men stood at the far end of the corridor, near the archway that led to the keep's inner courtyard. She had not heard them approach, which meant they were very good, or had been there already, or both. They were not Ashford wolves. She knew that immediately, the way wolves know things, by scent, by posture, by the quality of the air around them. These men smelled of pine and iron, and something older, darker, like deep forest and old stone. Their clothing was fine, but severe. No embroidery, no display, only well-cut wool and leather, and the kind of stillness that comes from men who have never needed to announce themselves. The one who had spoken was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her with open, unguarded curiosity. He was dark-haired and sharp-featured, with a mouth that suggested he found most situations at least faintly amusing. Beside him stood a broader man with a red-brown beard and an expression of cheerful, uncomplicated interest, like a man who had just discovered something unexpectedly worth his time. The third man stood slightly apart. He was not leaning. He was not smiling. He was simply standing in the way that certain people stand, without effort, without performance, with the complete and absolute stillness of something that does not need to move to make its presence felt. He was tall, dark-eyed, and he was looking at Nora with an expression she could not immediately name, not pity, not amusement. Something quieter and more serious than either. The sharp-featured one spoke again. "The Ashford boy is a fool," he said pleasantly, "in case that observation is useful to you." Nora looked at all 3 of them. "Who are you?" she said. The red-bearded one smiled broadly. The sharp-featured one tilted his head. And the third man, the still one, the quiet one, the one whose eyes had not left her face since she turned, said nothing at all. But he took one step forward, out of the shadow, and into the torchlight, and the banner visible through the archway behind him caught the light at the same moment. Blackfield, Silver Wolf. The crest of a pack she knew from her father's maps, only as a name written in the far north of the territories, Ashenvale, the Alpha King's pack. Nora had heard the name Ashenvale the way most people who lived in the southern territories heard it. Distantly, as one hears thunder from the other side of a mountain range, present, real, but separated from daily life by enough distance that it remained more legend than fact. The Ashenvale pack held the northern territories from the Grey Wood to the Stoneback Ridge, a stretch of land so vast that 3 of the allied southern packs could fit inside its borders with room remaining. They answered to no elder council. They sent no tribute. They came to the Iron Hollow feasts when they chose to, and when they did not choose to, no one sent a second invitation. Their Alpha King had not attended a claiming feast in 11 years. Nora looked at the banner and then back at the three men, and something rearranged itself quietly inside her understanding of the last 30 seconds. Draven Ashenvale, she said, not a question. She was looking at the still one. He inclined his head. A small movement, precise and unhurried, the kind of acknowledgement that contains neither warmth nor coldness, but only a complete and serious attention. Up close, in the torchlight, she could see the details she had missed from across the corridor. The faint scar along his left jaw, the way his dark eyes held light without reflecting it softly, the particular quality of his hands, which were still at his sides, and looked like they had done difficult things and knew it. "You know the name," he said. His voice was low and even, with no particular inflection, the voice of a man who speaks rarely enough that each word carries its own weight. "I know the crest," Nora said. "My father kept maps." Something shifted in his expression. It was not a smile. It was something more considered than a smile, a brief internal movement that didn't quite reach the surface. "Maps," he repeated. "Old ones." She kept her voice level. The corridor was cold, and she was standing in her sister's embroidered dress, and the man who had promised to call her name had just bound himself publicly to another woman, and she was having a conversation with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories in a dim passageway, as though this were a perfectly ordinary sequence of events. She decided to simply continue as though it were. The Ashenvale borders were marked in red. "My father said, whoever held the Greywood held the North." "Your father was correct," Draven said. "The sharp-featured one." She would learn his name was Cale, the king's youngest general, and, she would later understand, the person Draven trusted most precisely because Cale trusted almost no one. Made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. "She's not frightened of you," he said to Draven, with the tone of a man reporting something genuinely interesting. "I can hear you," Nora said. "I know," Cale said, and smiled at her with complete unrepentance. "I said it for your benefit as much as his. It's worth knowing that it's notable. Most people, when they realize who he is, become immediately and profoundly focused on the floor. The red-bearded one, Garrett, she would learn, the king's bonded lieutenant, and the person most likely in any given situation to say exactly what everyone else was thinking, nodded with evident agreement. "There was a pack elder from the Westmere delegation last season," he offered helpfully, who actually walked backward out of the room. "Garrett," Draven said. "I'm providing context," Garrett said. Nora looked at Draven. He was watching her with that same quality of attention. Serious, unperformed, the gaze of a man who was actually looking rather than simply directing his eyes at a thing. It was, she realized, slightly uncomfortable in the way that genuine attention is always slightly uncomfortable when you are not accustomed to receiving it. "Why are you in the corridor?" she asked. "We were returning from the courtyard," he said. "We arrived late. I prefer to observe before entering rooms." And the corridor offered a useful vantage. It did. She understood then that he had been watching the hall through the archway, that he had seen what happened at the high table. That all three of them had, which explained the quality of attention they'd given her from the moment she turned around. Not the attention of men who had glimpsed something interesting, but the attention of men who had already been watching before she knew she was being watched. "Then you saw," she said. "Yes," Draven said, simply, without softening it or making it into something it wasn't. She appreciated that more than she expected to. Pity would have been harder to stand. Honesty she could meet squarely. "I'm going home," she said. It was not a performance of dignity, it was simply true. She had come to Iron Hollow for a reason that no longer existed, and there was nothing left to wait for, and her sister's cottage was 4 miles south through the forest road, and she knew that road well enough to walk it in the dark. "Through the Ashfield Road?" Cale asked. His tone had changed slightly, still light, but with something attentive beneath it. "Yes. At this hour, alone. I've done it before." Cale and Garrett exchanged a look that communicated several things in the efficient shorthand of men who have known each other a long time. Draven did not look at either of them. He kept his eyes on Nora. "There are 3 Voss pack wolves at the south gate," he said. "They arrived with Delia Voss's entourage." They've been drinking since midday. A pause. The Ashfield Road runs directly past the south gate. Nora said nothing. She had not known about the Voss wolves. She recalculated the walk home in her mind and arrived at an unpleasant set of conclusions. I can go through the East Passage, she said. The East Passage has been closed since last winter. Structural damage to the arch. He said it without emphasis, without any suggestion that he was constructing an argument. He was simply providing information. The way a man who knows a territory provides information about that territory. She looked at him steadily. You know Iron Hollow's architecture. I know most structures in the northern and central territories, he said. It's useful. From the feasting hall behind them, she could hear the sound of the celebration continuing, voices rising, someone beginning a pack song. The deep collective sound of wolves who had eaten well and drunk well and had no reason to feel anything other than satisfied with the evening. The sound made the corridor feel colder by contrast. Nora straightened slightly, though she had not realized she had let herself settle. She thought about Mara, who was not here tonight, because someone had to stay with the two ewes who were close to lambing, and who had pressed the dress into Nora's arms and said you deserved to be seen. She thought about the 8 months of letters and meetings in River Meadows, and the particular quality of hope that had sustained her through the gray end of winter and the uncertain start of spring. She thought about Cole Ashford standing at the high table with his hand on Delia Voss's arm, not looking across the room, not looking anywhere near the place where Nora had been standing. Then she stopped thinking about all of it, because there was no use in it tonight, and she had 4 miles of forest road between herself and the place where she was known and safe. I'll take the north passage to the outer road and come around, she said. That adds 2 miles, Garrett said. Garrett, she said, and something in her voice, some dry, quiet edge that came from being tired and composed and unwilling to be managed, made him blink and then unexpectedly grin. She does that like you do, he said to Draven. The single word, just the name, and then the silence that's supposed to do the rest of the work. Draven looked at Garrett for 1 moment, with an expression of perfect blankness. Then he looked back at Nora. We will escort you to the Ashfield Road, he said. It's not a request. It's also not an imposition on your independence. It's a practical solution to a problem that exists regardless of whether you prefer to manage alone. Nora considered this. She had been managing alone for 3 years, since her father's death and the inheritance of the cottage and the small ruined apple orchard behind it that produced nothing but overgrown grass and memories. She was good at it. But she was also honest enough with herself to recognize when a situation called for something other than solitary endurance. All right, she said. They walked out through the courtyard into the cold mountain air, and the night smell hit her like something clean. Pine and stone and the distant dark green scent of the graywood forest on the northern horizon. Faint but present. Wild and old in a way that made the grief of the last hour feel very small and very human. And, she thought, probably survivable. Beside her, 3 feet of cold air and dark wool separating them. Draven walked without speaking, but once, on the steep path down from the keep's south wall, she stepped on a loose stone and caught herself, and she felt him shift his weight fractionally to her left, not touching her, not reaching out, just adjusting his position in the way that a wolf adjusts in proximity to something it is quietly, instinctively watching over. She noticed it. She said nothing, but she noticed it. The apple orchard looked worse in daylight. Nora had known this. In the abstract way one knows things that are too familiar to register clearly, but standing at the edge of the property the morning after the claiming feast, with the cold autumn light falling flat and honest across the overgrown rows, she saw it the way a stranger might see it, which was to say, without the mercy of habit. The trees were old, their bark deeply furrowed and gray, their branches knotted into shapes that suggested decades of neglect rather than deliberate pruning. The grass between the rows had grown waist-high in places and gone to seed. 3 of the stone boundary markers had fallen and not been righted. The small wooden press house at the far end of the property had lost half its roof to a storm 2 winters ago, and no one had repaired it because there had been no harvest worth pressing and no money to spend on a building that served no function. Her father had called it the Ashfield Orchard. In the old land records, it appeared as a property of moderate value. In practice, It was 47 trees that had not been properly tended in 15 years, and a press house that was quietly becoming part of the ground. Nora looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside, changed out of her good shoes, put on her work boots and her heaviest apron, and went back out with a pair of long-handled shears. She worked through the morning without stopping. The physical effort of it was useful. The clean, demanding logic of cutting back dead wood and clearing the grass from around the root bases of the nearest trees. Work that asked only her hands and her attention, and gave her mind something honest to do instead of rehearsing the previous evening in the particular punishing detail that grief tends to prefer. She had cried once, briefly, before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and the sound of the ewes shifting in the small barn coming through the wall. That had been sufficient. She did not intend to do it again. Mara found her at midday, coming from the cottage with a cloth-wrapped loaf and 2 boiled eggs, and an expression that communicated everything she knew and everything she was choosing not to say. They sat on the low stone wall at the orchard's edge and ate together in the particular comfortable silence of people who have shared enough years that silence is its own language. The bread was dark and dense and good, and the autumn air tasted of fallen leaves and the first cold edge of the season turning, and above them the sky was the pale, serious blue of a late-season day that knows winter is coming. "Mara," Nora said finally. "Don't," her sister said, not unkindly. "Not yet. Eat first." Nora ate. When the bread was gone, she said, "He didn't look for me. In the room. He didn't look." Mara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I don't suppose he did. I think he made the decision before he arrived. I think the letters were—" She stopped. Started again. "I think he was managing me, keeping the situation comfortable until it resolved itself in the direction he had already chosen." "Yes," Mara said. Simple and certain, and without any attempt to soften it. This was one of the things Nora loved most about her sister, the refusal to dilute truth in the name of comfort, as though truth were something that needed to be made more palatable rather than something that could be stood up to directly. "He was a coward," Nora said. "He was," Mara agreed. "A handsome coward with a good family name and no understanding of what he was being given." She paused. "There's a particular kind of fool who only recognizes value after it's left the room." Nora thought about that. Then she thought about the corridor at Iron Hollow Keep, and 3 men standing in the torchlight, and she almost said something, and then didn't, because she was not yet certain what there was to say. She worked through the afternoon. By the time the light began to fail, she had cleared the grass from around the first 6 trees and cut back the worst of the dead branches. The old wood was dense and dark at the core, still alive, she thought, neglected and overgrown and fruitless for years, but at the root, underneath all the evidence of abandonment, still alive. She was thinking about this, her hands resting on one of the old trunks, and her forehead tipped forward to lean against the bark, when she heard the horses on the road, not the sound of a single traveler. 3 horses, moving at an unhurried pace, the quality of hoofbeats that belonged to animals well cared for, and ridden by men who knew what they were doing. She straightened and turned before the riders came into view, and she already knew, some part of her already knew, in the way that wolves sometimes know things before the knowing has any rational basis. Draven rode in the center, Cale on his left, Garrett on his right. They were in plain riding clothes, no ceremonial dress, no pack banners. They could have been any 3 men on the Ashfield Road, except that no 3 men on the Ashfield Road carried themselves like this, with that particular unhurried quality of wolves, who have never in their lives had to perform authority, because it is simply a thing they are. Draven looked at the orchard as they drew up to the road's edge. He looked at it the way he seemed to look at most things, carefully, without any particular expression, taking it in. "You started this morning," he said. It was not quite a question. Nora looked up at him from where she stood between 2 old trees, shears in hand, her hair coming loose from its braid, and her apron carrying the evidence of several hours of work. "How do you know?" "The cut grass around the root bases is still pale. It hasn't had time to weather." He looked at the nearest tree. "These are old stock, probably 60 years, possibly more. My grandfather planted them," she said. "His grandfather showed him how. Then the root systems go deep." He dismounted, not quickly, but without hesitation, the movement of a man who has made a decision and is simply acting on it, and handed his reins to Garrett, who took them with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this. "Old orchards are more recoverable than they appear," Draven said, walking toward the low stone wall. "The visible damage is almost always worse than the actual damage. The trees remember what they are." Nora watched him stop at the wall and look across the rows with the focused, systematic attention of a man assessing something he understands. "You know orchards," she said. "Ashen Vale's western territory runs along the Greywood Vale," he said. "There are 3 apple orchards in the valley settlements. I've managed their recovery over the last 8 years. He looked at her. 2 of them were in worse condition than this. From the road, Cale spoke with cheerful lightness. He also spent 4 days once personally rebuilding a stone boundary wall in the Greywood Vale, because the mason who was contracted took one look at the location and left. He paused. "I mention this not to impress you, but to establish that his interest in reclamation projects is genuine and occasionally excessive." "Cale?" Draven said. "Context," Cale said pleasantly. "I'm providing context." Something moved in Nora's chest. Careful, cautious, the feeling of something that had been very still beginning, tentatively, to consider motion. She looked at Draven. He was still looking at the orchard, but as she watched him, he turned and looked at her, and the quality of his gaze was the same as it had been in the corridor the night before. Direct, serious, without performance. "Why are you here?" she asked. Plainly. She was too tired for anything but plain. He considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Ashen Vale has trade interest in this region," he said. "Apple harvest from the Ashfield territory has historically supplied 3 of the northern settlements through winter." A pause. "And I wanted to see whether you'd still be standing in the orchard this morning, or whether last night would have been enough to stop you." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. She looked at him for a moment. "And?" "You're standing in the orchard," he said, "with shears. That tells you something?" "It tells me what I needed to know." He said it as though it were the most straightforward conclusion in the world. And then he looked back at the trees with that calm, measuring attention, and Nora stood between 2 60-year-old apple trees in her work boots and her stained apron, and felt, for the first time since the previous evening, something that was not grief and not composure, but something warmer and more uncertain than either. "The press house needs a new roof first," she said after a moment. "Yes," he agreed, "before anything else. I don't have materials for it. I have people in Iron Hollow until the end of the week," he said. "Timber, slate, labor, it can be arranged." She looked at him steadily. "That's a significant offer from someone I met last night in a corridor." "Yes," he said again. He did not apologize for it or diminish it. He simply held her gaze with that still, serious quality that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he was, a man who meant things and said them, and then waited, without pressure, for the other person to decide. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once, as though this were precisely the answer he had expected and respected. "We'll be at the Iron Hollow Inn through Friday," he said. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, and mounted with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and Garrett handed back the reins with an expression of deeply satisfied amusement, and Cale on his left looked across at Nora with one raised eyebrow and a look that said, clearly and without words, "Well then." They rode back up the Ashfield Road, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded into the trees, and Nora stood at the edge of her ruined orchard in the failing light, and looked at the 60-year-old apple trees that her grandfather had planted, and thought about roots that go deep. About things that remember what they are even after years of being left alone. She picked up her shears and kept working until she couldn't see her hands anymore. She sent word to the Iron Hollow Inn on Thursday, not on Wednesday, when she had stood at the cottage door 3 separate times with a folded note in her hand, and then gone back inside and set it on the table and found something else to do. Not on Tuesday, when Mara had watched her rewash a pot that was already clean, and said nothing but had that particular quality of silence that meant she was saying everything. On Thursday morning, with 1 day remaining before Draven's stated departure, Nora sat at the kitchen table before dawn, and wrote 4 sentences on a piece of folded paper and gave it to the miller's boy, who ran the Ashfield Road twice daily, and who accepted the task with the indifference of someone entirely uninvested in its significance. The note said, "The press house roof first, then we discuss the rest. I don't accept arrangements I haven't agreed to in full. N." By mid-afternoon, 3 men arrived from Iron Hollow, with a cart of timber and slate. They were Ashenvale wolves. She could tell by the faint northern pine scent of them, different from the local pack smell, older and colder in the way of forests that see less sun. They were polite, efficient, and entirely professional, and they began on the press house roof with the focused competence of people who had been given clear instructions and intended to follow them. Garrett arrived an hour later with 2 additional hands and a detailed sketch of the repair plan, which he unrolled on the stone wall and explained to Nora with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed logistics. Draven arrived last, on foot, alone, coming up the Ashfield Road in the gray afternoon light with no ceremony and no announcement. He stopped at the orchard's edge and looked at the press house, where the new timber was already going up along the damaged section. And then he looked at Nora, who was standing at the boundary wall with her arms crossed, watching the work. "You waited until Thursday," he said. "I was thinking," she said, "about whether to trust an offer from a man you met in a corridor." Among other things, he came and stood beside her at the wall, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, the deep resinous scent of Ashenvale on him, pine and old stone, and something darker underneath, like iron left in weather. They watched the work together in silence for a while, the sound of hammers and the clean smell of fresh-cut timber mixing with the cold autumn air. And it was, she noticed this carefully, not uncomfortable. Silence with most people creates a pressure, a social demand to fill it. Silence with Draven simply was. He did not seem to require anything from a moment except whatever the moment actually contained. "Tell me about the orchard," he said eventually. Not the condition, the history. She told him. She told him about her grandfather, who had come to the Ashfield territory as a young man with nothing but a cart of tools and a handful of apple seeds given to him by an elder in the eastern settlements who claimed the variety was older than the current pack alliances. She told him about her father, who had maintained the trees faithfully until the illness took his strength in stages over 4 years, the orchard declining as he declined, both of them losing ground together in a way that had felt, to a younger Nora watching it happen, unbearably like a single thing dying, rather than 2 separate things. She told him about inheriting the property at 20, and being advised by 3 different people to sell it, because the land wasn't worth the back taxes without a productive harvest, and deciding not to sell it, because her grandfather had planted those trees, and they were still alive, and she was not prepared to be the generation that gave up on them. Draven listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Eastern Settlement's elder," he said. "The one who gave your grandfather the seeds. Do you know the name?" She thought. "Harwin, I think. My father mentioned it once, an old name." Something shifted in Draven's expression. That same brief internal movement she had seen in the corridor, something considered and careful, moving beneath the surface. "Harwin Greywood," he said. He was the last keeper of the old Greywood orchards before the northern border was reorganized. He gave seeds to travelers he thought would use them well. A pause. "The Greywood variety produces a fruit with a scent unlike anything from the standard cultivated stock. Wolves respond to it differently. It was used for centuries in pack ceremonies, bonding rituals, healing rites, the formal welcome of new members into established packs." Nora looked at him. "You're saying my grandfather's orchard is—" "I'm saying the seeds have a history older than most of the current pack alliances," he said. "And that if these trees are Greywood stock, and the root systems are as deep as the age suggests, then what you have here is not a ruined orchard." He looked across the rows. "It's a dormant one." She stood very still. "How do you know about Harwin Greywood?" "Ashenvale's territory borders the original Greywood Vale," he said. "The history of that land is part of the history of my pack." He turned and looked at her directly. "I recognized the bark pattern on your trees when I saw them yesterday. I've seen Greywood stock before. I should have said so immediately." The honesty of the admission, the simple, undefended acknowledgement that he had held something back and was now choosing not to, caught her more off guard than the information itself. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wasn't certain how to explain the significance without it sounding like a claim on the property," he said. "It isn't. The orchard is yours. The history of the stock is simply context." Nora thought about roots that go deep, about things that remember what they are. "Context," she said quietly. "Yes." From the press house, Garrett shouted something to the timber workers about the angle of the new slate, and one of the Ashenvale wolves shouted back with the specific tone of a craftsman who does not want unsolicited opinions about his angle, and Cale, who had apparently materialized at some point without Nora noticing, leaned against the far wall and observed the disagreement with visible delight. Nora almost smiled. The almost surprised her. She looked back at the trees, the 60-year-old graywood stock, her grandfather's careful rows, dormant and overgrown and full, apparently, of a history she hadn't known she was standing in the middle of. Then she looked at Draven, who was watching her with that steady, serious attention that she had stopped finding unsettling, and started finding, in a way she was not entirely prepared for, like something she wanted to remain in proximity to. "I need to understand what recovery actually looks like," she said. "Timeline, labor, cost of materials beyond what you've already sent. I won't be managed and I won't accept charity. And I need to know what you're expecting in return for the investment. A fair share of the harvest, once the orchard produces," he said. "Supplied to the northern settlements at an agreed price. A formal trade arrangement between the Ashfield property and Ashenvale territory, documented and signed by both parties." He paused. "Nothing that isn't written down. Nothing that isn't agreed to in full." She heard her own words from the Thursday note return to her, and the corners of her mouth moved before she could prevent it. "You remembered what I wrote," she said. "I remember things that matter," he said. Simply, without embellishment. The hammers continued on the press house roof. The cold afternoon light shifted across the orchard rows, and Nora stood at the boundary wall of her grandfather's dormant graywood orchard and felt something she recognized, cautiously, as the specific feeling of standing at the beginning of something, not the anxious, hopeful, "please don't disappoint me" feeling she had carried for 8 months toward Cole Ashford, but something steadier and more grounded, something that felt less like hope and more like recognition. "All right," she said. "Written down, agreed to in full." "All right," he said. They stayed at the wall until the light failed completely, talking about recovery timelines and pruning schedules and the particular requirements of graywood stock through a northern winter, and at no point did either of them acknowledge that they were standing closer together than the conversation required, or that the space between them had narrowed without either of them deciding to narrow it, or that the cold air between them had become, at some point that neither could precisely identify, significantly warmer than it had been. Mara saw it from the cottage window. She said nothing. But later, setting the table for supper, she hummed something quietly to herself with the satisfied private expression of someone who has been right about a thing and is decent enough not to mention it. Winter came to Ashfield the way it always did. Not suddenly, but with a kind of deliberate patience, the cold advancing in increments across the valley, until one morning Nora woke to frost on the inside of the cottage windows and understood that the season had fully arrived. The apple trees stood in their rows with their bare branches dark against the pale sky, and the new press house roof held clean and solid against the first hard rains, the Ashenvale timber proving exactly as good as the men who had laid it. Draven did not leave at the end of the week. He did not announce this decision. He simply did not leave. The Iron Hollow Inn remained his base, and he rode to the orchard most days, sometimes with Cale or Garrett, sometimes alone, and he worked alongside Nora with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who had said he understood graywood stock and had meant it. He knew which branches to take and which to leave. He knew how to read the bark for signs of life beneath the gray surface, pressing 2 fingers against the wood with the patient attention of someone listening for a heartbeat. He knew the old methods, the ones written in no current manual, but carried in the knowledge of packs that had tended the same land for generations. And he shared them without condescension, explaining once, and then stepping back and letting her hands do the learning. Mara watched all of this from various distances, with an expression of serene vindication that she was too well-mannered to make explicit. The formal trade agreement was signed on the last day of the month, witnessed by Garrett and by the Ashfield village elder, a stout woman named Bren, who had known Nora's father, and who looked at Draven Ashenvale across her table with the careful, measuring expression of someone deciding whether to be impressed or suspicious, and landing, eventually, on a cautious combination of both. The document was thorough. It specified harvest percentages, transport responsibilities, pricing structures, and a clause, Nora had written it herself, stating that all terms were subject to annual renegotiation by mutual agreement. Draven had read that clause and looked up at her with the particular quality of attention that she was learning meant he was genuinely pleased by something, but would not perform the pleasure. Annual renegotiation, he said. I don't sign things I can't revisit, she said. No, he agreed. I wouldn't expect you to. He signed without asking her to remove it. The snow came in the third week of winter, and with it came Cole Ashford. Nora was in the press house when she heard the horse on the road, a single rider, the pace of someone who had made a decision, and was following it before he could reconsider. She did not immediately know who it was. But when she came to the press house door and saw him dismounting at the boundary wall, she felt something go flat and quiet inside her, the way a field goes flat and quiet after a fire has moved through it. Not pain, not anger. Something more final than either. The complete absence of the feeling that had sustained her through 8 months of letters and River Meadow conversations. The recognition that what had once lived in that particular place inside her was simply no longer there. Cole looked older than she remembered him. Or perhaps she was simply seeing him without the generous filter of hope. He was still handsome. He still had that practiced, effortless quality in the way he held himself. But she saw now what she had not let herself see before, the slight restlessness in his eyes. The way his confidence was the kind that needed an audience to exist, the specific expression of a man who has made a calculation and is now attempting to reverse it. Nora, he said. Cole, she said. She did not move from the press house door. He looked at the orchard, at the new roof above her head, at the cleared rows, the righted boundary markers, the evidence of months of deliberate, systematic work. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, recalculation, something that might have been genuine regret, or might have been regret's more self-interested cousin. You've been working the property, he said. Yes. It looks... He paused. It looks different. That's generally what happens when you tend something, she said. Her voice was even. She was not performing composure now. She simply felt composed, in the way that comes not from controlling emotion, but from the absence of the particular emotion that had previously required controlling. He came through the gate and stopped 10 feet from her. I made a mistake, he said. He said it with the directness of a man who had rehearsed it, which did not make it untrue, only insufficient. The Voss arrangement, my father pressed for it. The alliance made strategic sense for the pack. I thought I could... He stopped, started again. I handled it badly. I should have spoken to you before the feast. Yes, Nora said. You should have. I want to explain. Cole. She said it quietly, without heat. You explained it at the claiming feast. Not with words, but clearly enough. She looked at him steadily. You made a choice. It was the right choice for what you needed. I don't hold that against you. A pause. But I'm not the same situation I was in the autumn. And I think what you're explaining isn't actually meant for me. It's meant to make you feel better about a thing you already did. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and she gave him some small credit for this, he did not argue. He looked at her with something genuinely unguarded for the first time in all the months she had known him, and she saw, briefly, the actual person underneath the practiced confidence, and she felt nothing for him except a mild and distant compassion. There are Ashenvale horses in the village, he said finally. His voice had changed, quieter, less rehearsed. 3 of them. People are saying the Alpha King has been at Iron Hollow for 6 weeks. Yes, Nora said. Is he? Cole stopped. Looked at the press house roof, looked at the cleared orchard rows. Understood she could see it happening in real time across his face, the full scope of what he had failed to recognize when it was standing in his feasting hall. wearing embroidered wildflowers. Is he here? With you? We have a trade arrangement, Nora said. The orchard supplies Ashenvale's northern settlements. Cole absorbed this. That's not all of it, he said. Not accusatory, simply certain. She did not confirm or deny it. She did not owe him the interior of her life. Goodbye, Cole, she said, gently. Finally, with the specific, irrevocable gentleness of a door being closed by someone who has already moved to another room, he left. She watched him mount and ride back up the Ashfield Road, and she waited until the sound of the hoofbeats was entirely gone, and then she went back into the press house and stood for a moment in the smell of fresh timber and old wood and the cold, clean air coming through the new roof slates. Then she went back to work. Draven arrived that afternoon and knew immediately that something had happened. She understood by now that this was simply a quality of his attention. He noticed changes in her the way he noticed changes in the orchard, with the same careful, non-invasive precision. He did not ask. He came and worked beside her in the press house, checking the new timber joints against the expected winter load. And after a while, she said, without looking up from the joint she was examining, Cole Ashford came this morning. I know, Draven said. Garrett saw him on the road. You didn't come. No. She looked up at him. Why? He held her gaze. Because it wasn't mine to handle, he said. Whatever needed to happen between you and him was yours. I had no right to insert myself into it, and you didn't need me to. The simplicity of it, the complete absence of possessiveness or performance, settled into her chest, like something that had been looking for exactly that shape of space. She looked at him for a long moment. He understood, she said, at the end. What he'd given up. Yes, Draven said. I imagine he did. He said it without satisfaction, without any of the easy triumph that the moment might have permitted a smaller man. He said it simply, because it was true, and then he went back to checking the timber joint. And Nora watched his hands on the wood, and thought about all the ways a person can demonstrate what they are without ever making a speech about it. Draven, she said. He looked up. The first night, she said. In the corridor at Iron Hollow, you said you'd been watching through the archway, that you prefer to observe before entering rooms. She paused. How long had you been watching? He was quiet for a moment. Long enough, he said. Long enough to see what? Long enough to see you walk into that hall alone, he said, wearing a dress that someone had made carefully for you, carrying yourself like someone who has never needed a room to confirm her worth, even when the room was the only thing she'd been told would give it to her. He set down the tool he was holding, long enough to watch you stand at the wall for 2 hours without moving, without seeking anyone's attention, without performing either confidence or hope. Long enough to see a woman who had been told by every available social signal that she did not belong in that room, and who was quietly, completely refusing to believe it. A pause. I had made up my mind before Cole Ashford stood up at the high table. Whatever he did was irrelevant to what I had already seen. The press house was very quiet. Outside, the snow was coming down again, soft and steady, muffling the world. You could have said that earlier, she said. You wouldn't have believed it earlier, he said. You needed to see it in actions before the words would mean anything. He looked at her steadily. I was willing to wait. Nora stood in the cold press house light and felt something move through her that was not cautious and was not tentative and was not the careful, managed, protective thing she had been tending since the autumn, like a small flame kept sheltered from wind. It was something older and less managed than that. It was the feeling of ground under her feet, the feeling of roots that go deep. She crossed the press house in 4 steps and kissed him. He was still for exactly 1 second. The stillness of complete surprise in a man not accustomed to being surprised. And then his hands came up and he kissed her back with the same quality that characterized everything he did. Total, unhurried, genuine attention. No performance, no calculation. Just presence, absolute and warm and steady as old timber. When they separated, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. unguarded in a way that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was apparently not frequently unguarded, open in the way of something that has been held very carefully for a long time and has finally been allowed to set itself down. "You could have done that earlier," he said. "I needed to see it in actions first," she said, before the words meant anything. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh, low and quiet and entirely unself-conscious. The laugh of a man who is genuinely delighted by something and has no interest in disguising it. She had not heard him laugh before. She thought she would like to hear it again. Spring came to Ashfield with the quality of something that had been promised and was now making good. The greywood apple trees woke slowly, the way old things wake, not in a rush, but with a deep, deliberate certainty, the buds pushing through the weathered bark in the first warm weeks, with the particular vigor of root systems that had been waiting rather than failing. By mid-spring, every tree in the orchard was in blossom, and the smell of it reached the Ashfield Road and beyond. A scent that was, as Draven had said, unlike anything from standard cultivated stock. Sweeter and darker and more complex, with something in it that made wolves pause on the road and turn toward the orchard with the automatic, instinctive attention of something recognized at a level below thought. Bren, the village elder, came to see it. She stood at the boundary wall and looked at the blossoming rose for a long time and then said quietly, "Your grandfather knew what he had." She looked at Nora. "I don't think he knew how much." Mara was there when the first real harvest came in late autumn, baskets of fruit carried from the rows to the press house in the early morning light, the air full of that deep, ceremonial scent. She stood at the edge of the orchard and watched her sister work alongside Draven and Garrett and two Ashenvale wolves who had come south for the harvest season, and her expression was the one she'd had since winter, settled, satisfied, quietly triumphant in the way of someone who had always known a thing and had simply been waiting for the evidence to catch up. Cale was there too, inevitably. He had spent an unreasonable portion of the year at Iron Hollow on various stated business that everyone understood was not primarily about business. He sat on the boundary wall eating an apple from the first picking and regarding the world with his habitual bright-eyed amusement. "This," he announced to no one in particular, "is the best apple I have ever eaten." "Everything you eat, you say that," Garrett said. "Because I mean it every time," Cale said. He took another bite. "These are genuinely extraordinary, though. There's something in them." He looked at the apple with sudden suspicion. "Is this the pack ceremony fruit Draven was talking about? Am I going to feel compelled to pledge loyalty to something?" "You already pledged loyalty to something," Garrett said. 12 years ago. "Yes, but I'd like it to remain a choice," Cale said. Nora laughed. It came out easily, the way things come out easily when they are simply true, and she noticed the ease of it, noticed that laughter had become, over these months, a thing she reached for rather than a thing she remembered to perform. Draven heard it from across the orchard. She saw him turn and look at her, that familiar quality of attention, steady and serious and warm in the specific way of warmth that doesn't announce itself. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and between them passed the particular communication of people who have learned each other's silences well enough that a look can contain a conversation. The formal pack acknowledgement happened in the winter of that year at the Iron Hollow claiming feast. The same hall, the same banners, the same smell of burning pine resin and tallow candles, and the gathered weight of pack hierarchy. Nora stood at the high table this time, not along the wall. She wore a dress that Mara had made, ivory linen again, because some things deserved to be revisited and rewritten. The embroidered flowers at the collar the same pale blue and white, but the hem fuller and the cut more formal, and the whole of it made with the hands of someone who had watched her sister become exactly what she had always been, only visible now to everyone. Draven stood beside her. He called her name in front of every wolf in Iron Hollow's feasting hall, with the same quality he brought to every declaration, without performance, without excess, in the even and absolute voice of a man who knows what he means, and means it completely. The sound that went through the hall was different from the sound she had heard there a year before. This one was deeper. Surprised in some quarters, recognizing in others. The Ashenvale wolves at the tables straightened with the specific pride of a pack that has watched their alpha king wait for something worth waiting for, and has now seen him arrive at it. Cole Ashford was somewhere in the hall. She did not look for him. She did not need to. Whatever he felt in that moment was his to carry, and she found, with genuine surprise at the completeness of it, that she felt nothing about his feeling, not satisfaction, not vindication, not even the distant compassion she had felt in the orchard that winter morning. He was simply a man in a room where other more important things were happening. And then he was gone from her awareness entirely, dissolved back into the irrelevance where the Nora of this year had always known he belonged. Mara, seated below the dais with the shine of someone trying very hard not to cry and mostly failing, caught her sister's eye across the hall. Nora looked at her and held the look. Her sister's face. The face she had grown up beside, the face that had pressed a dress into her arms and said, "You deserve to be seen," and let herself feel, fully and without management, the weight and the warmth of what the year had made of them both. Then she turned back to the hall, and to Draven beside her, and to the life that was hers. The Greywood orchard produced its second harvest the following autumn, and its third the year after, each one larger than the last, as the old roots found their full depth again. The northern settlements received their share by agreement, on time, at the negotiated price, renegotiated annually as the contract specified. The press house became a working building again, smelling of fermenting apple and oak and the particular rich complexity of fruit that is grown slowly in old ground and carries the patience of that growth in its flesh. Mara stayed in Ashfield. She had a life there. The ewes, the cottage, the village rhythm she had shaped herself into over years, and she had no desire to leave it, only to have her sister close enough to visit on a good road, which she now did. The two of them sat on the boundary wall on harvest mornings the way they always had, with bread and boiled eggs and the comfortable silence of people who have said everything that matters and no longer need to say it all the time. Cale visited too often and ate too many apples, and contributed to every situation his particular quality of bright-eyed, sharp-tongued observation that served the dual purpose of keeping everyone honest and keeping everything from becoming too solemn. Garrett managed the logistics of the trade arrangement with the thoroughness of a man who loves a well-organized system, and managed Cale with the practiced weariness of a man who has long since accepted that some things cannot be organized. And Draven was there, in the orchard in the early mornings, his hands on the bark, checking the health of the old stock with the same focused care with which he checked everything he had committed to protecting. In the press house in the evenings, going over the harvest records by firelight with the same serious attention he brought to packed documents. In the cottage kitchen sometimes, sitting across from Mara with a cup of something warm, listening to her talk about the ewes with the respectful interest of a man who understands that the lives of the people he loves are made of specific, particular things, and that those things deserve attention. The Alpha King of Ashenvale learned to make Mara's bread. He was not naturally gifted at it. It took him 4 attempts before the loaf came out with a texture that Mara judged acceptable, and he approached each failed attempt with the same unbothered, systematic patience with which he approached everything, and on the morning the 4th loaf came out right. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him set it on the table, with an expression of quiet, unperformed satisfaction, and felt the full, completed weight of everything the year had given her. She thought about her grandfather, who had carried apple seeds across the territory on the word of an old pack elder who had seen something in him worth trusting. She thought about her father, who had tended those seeds into trees, and the trees into an orchard, and the orchard into the specific shape of a life. She thought about standing at the edge of 60-year-old apple trees in her work boots, thinking about roots that go deep and about things that remember what they are. She went into the kitchen. Draven looked up. "Good loaf," she said. "Acceptable loaf," he said. "Mara's standard is higher than that." "Mara's standard is unreasonably high." "Yes," he said, "but worth reaching for." She sat across from him at the kitchen table, and they ate the bread together in the early morning light. The sound of the orchard outside in the autumn air, the smell of apple and pine and wood smoke, and the deep, old, particular scent of Ashenvale that had come to mean, for Nora, the same thing that the cottage walls meant, and the orchard rose meant, and her sister's voice meant. The smell of home, arrived at by a road she had not planned to walk, through a door she had not known she was. looking for, into a life that had been waiting, with patient, deep-rooted certainty, for her to find it. Outside, the gray wood apples turned gold in the morning light. The orchard, after all its years of silence, was full,